field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing song and the carrying sign, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. Young people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children, what's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. We're doing a very timely show tonight on Bill Gates, who is very involved with the coronavirus pandemic. I'm sure many of you have seen him on TV many times. My guests to discuss this are Tim Schwab, who is a freelance journalist based in Washington, D.C., and he did an investigation into the Gates Foundation, which was part of a 2019 Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellowship. Previously, he was a researcher at Food and Water Watch, which is one of my favorite environmental organizations. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Thanks for having me, Lauren. Nice to be here.
Great. And on the bottom, below the two of us, we have Rob Larson, who is a professor of economics at Tacoma Community College in Washington State. And he's the author of Bit Tyrants, the Political Economy of Silicon Valley. And he also authored an article for Jacobin called Bill Gates' Philanthropic Giving is a Racket. So your article was titled, Tim, it's different because when you Google it, it has one title. Yeah. And then when you click on the title, so which title do you like to use?
What are the two titles? Remind me. It's the Charity Paradox and the other one.
Yes, and then Bill Gates is giving to himself or something.
I suppose I like the Charity Paradox better. You know, I still haven't managed to get a print copy of the. So I don't know which title went with the actual print copy.
So we know that it was really interesting, and I just watched this 8-minute TED Talk that he did in 2015, in which he predicted. He actually said, and I quote, "If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war, not missiles, but microbes." So everybody's talking about how he predicted this, 5 years ago. And then he talked about it again in Davos in 2017. And he's also giving $100 million to the Gates Foundation is spending $100 million, but they're focusing it on lower and middle income countries with limited health infrastructure. And he says there needs to be, quote, a larger systemic change that requires governments to step up with tens of billions of dollars additionally, globally coordinated funding in order to meet the long-term challenge of improving our ability to respond to future, quote, once-in-a-century pandemics. And he says it has to be driven by the public sector because, quote, pandemic products are extraordinarily high-risk investments. There is insufficient return on these investments. So I think this kind of shows where his orientation is. He thinks about his charity as a way to get a return on his investment. So we're going to talk about your investigation first, Tim. Maybe you could talk about the scope of the investigation, how long you spent on it, how much you looked into it, what made you decide to do this? Was this your idea, or did this foundation hire you to do it? Talk about the genesis and the scope.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that Bill Gates, he has an enormous amount of power over public policy that's been relatively unexamined, and certainly unexamined by the Fourth Estate. There's been hundreds or thousands of news articles written about Bill Gates, but they're almost always going to lead with some multi-million-dollar donation he's giving to save the world. It's very rare that journalists will look back on that donation and try to measure or evaluate or report on the effectiveness of it, the merits of it, the potential problems of it. It's always this kind of forward-looking journalism that tends to praise the Gates Foundation. Whereas, my view is that the Gates Foundation is a structure of power and we should treat it as such, which means challenging its power, not worshiping it. But there really hasn't been much investigative journalism, and maybe even much critical journalism of the Gates Foundation over the years. The last major investigative series was by the LA Times in 2007, which is a great investigation that I encourage people to take a look at. It looked at the Gates Foundation's investments in controversial companies like chocolate companies that were depending on child slave labor, for example. But that was 2007. That's 15 years ago, practically. So I thought it was timely to do an investigation. The article I published in The Nation, it's 5,000 words. I hope your listeners, viewers, supporters take a look at it. I think it's halfway readable. But what I want to say is that in some ways, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface. That there's so much that the Gates Foundation has done over the last 2 decades as the world's largest philanthropy. It just really hasn't been questioned in a way that are certainly not commensurate with the kind of power it wields on the global stage.
Right. Now, I had Chuck Collins on my show a couple of weeks ago, and he worked with Bill Gates Sr. to establish this foundation. And it actually started out, different than what his son turned it into. And you say in here, when you were speaking to Chuck Collins for your article, right. He said to me, it's a problem that his son is going to give. At the time, it was like $80 billion to the foundation and never have to pay taxes on any of that wealth, Colin recalls. His view was that there should be a cap on the lifetime amount of wealth that could be given to charity where you get a deduction. So it sounds like his father had the right idea, but then Bill changed it, Junior?
You might know more of the story than I do, Lauren. When I talked to Chuck, he was working with Bill Gates Sr. on a separate issue unrelated to the Gates Foundation that was looking at, it was kind of a separate campaign that Bill Gates Sr., sort of a passion project of his, to preserve the estate tax, which is the tax that wealthy people pay or that their estates pay when they die. So when Bill Gates, if he were to die today, barring any, clever tax attorneys or a charitable foundation in the way, 40% of his wealth would go to the public treasury. Which would be something like $40 billion. And there was, a couple decades ago, there was an effort to repeal or diminish the estate tax. And Bill Gates Sr. and Chuck Collins went kind of on a national campaign to promote the preservation of the estate tax.
But of course, now we know that Bill Gates Jr. has spoken against, I'm not sure the estate tax probably, but certainly the wealth tax that.
Yeah, so Bill Gates loves the estate tax, and he talks about how important it is, but he's not going to probably pay it. Yeah. Because if you're a billionaire and you give away all of your money as a philanthropist, then you no longer have this multi-billion-dollar estate that can be subject to that estate tax. So that's 40% of his wealth that otherwise would go to the public coffers, but it's not going to because he's this philanthropist. And so, go ahead.
You say, okay, so let's talk about philanthropy, because usually we think about philanthropy giving directly to poor and needy people or poor and needy organizations. But he describes his philanthropy as, quote unquote, creative capitalism and, quote unquote, catalytic philanthropy, where he is leveraging, quote, all the tools of capitalism to connect the promise of philanthropy with the power of private enterprise. So why don't you talk about what that looks like in practice with his $50 billion foundation?
I in the article, I track it kind of to the way that I think Bill Gates sees Microsoft as having developed the kind of software products and tools that have, open, expanded horizons and help people do so many things in the world. And that's kind of a driving ethos also at the Gates Foundation, this idea of working with and through the private sector to develop public goods. I feel like Rob should probably weigh in. He's done such great research on Microsoft and has this kind of this bigger perspective on Microsoft and the Gates Foundation.
Well, we were going to get to that afterwards, but we could certainly get to that now. Rob, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, for sure. So Microsoft is one of the firms that was the first big software company way before Google and Facebook back in the early 80s. Microsoft and the employees there worked together to produce the first major computer operating system, which of course is Windows, which most folks will be familiar with from using computers, especially at your job, where Windows really dominates. And the thing about markets for software, and this includes operating systems or games or anything else, is that you do need a certain amount of like technical standardization. Like if you want to get a cool video game or a useful application like for word processing or something like that, it needs to work on your computer. And you may have had that experience in your life where you download something or get a game and it won't work on your phone or on your computer because it hasn't been ported. It hasn't been rewritten as a software program to work with that operating system and its application programming interfaces. So the thing is, markets that are distributed, where the product is distributed through networks like these, they have what we call a network effect, which is a very strong enhancer of monopolization in markets. Some markets get monopolized without this, but this is a particular thing that makes them much more likely to occur. And basically, if it's the 80s and Windows has become the standard operating system used by all the IBM PCs and all of its famous clones, if you're making a game or a software program, you want to make it to run on Windows rather than a much smaller system like, say, Apple. Many more developers want to make it to run on Windows because that's where all the users are. And then that presence of users attracts those programmers. Having all those games and applications made attracts more users. So you get this positive feedback cycle in these kind of markets that are mediated through network processes. And that includes most of these software markets today. So these guys end up being fairly strong monopolists, but we should remember under America's post-80s antitrust law, it's pretty forgiving. And when Microsoft went through its big antitrust trial in the 90s, which some of the listeners, I'm sure, will be too young to remember, but it was a very, very big deal at that time. And that trial went on for many years. They didn't get in trouble for having a monopoly on, with the Windows operating system, which, everyone agreed that they did. When you have 90+% of the market, we start using the M word to describe you. But it wasn't so much that they had that, because that happened through straight economics and the network effect. They got in trouble for monopolization. That's when you take an existing monopoly that the law sees as legitimate, like in operating systems, and then you use that to take over another adjacent market. And the big one in this case was that they used the operating system monopoly to take over the web browser market. Back at a time in the 90s when the internet was this new thing and you need a browser because there's like 200 websites, and how are you going to find your way through all those websites? So by taking over the browser market and by crushing Netscape, and all this stuff came out in the court process, really, really ugly monopolist language used by the firm to crush these competitors and take away their oxygen and stuff. It's during that trial where Gates is looking like hell on TV night after night on the nightly news, back when people watched the nightly news. It's in that era that all of his big ticket donations to the foundation happened, right? So over the 18 months of that trial, that's when Gates put in, $20.3 billion of donations into that foundation, which is over 70% of his total investment in that foundation. So all I'm trying to draw with this is, you should realize like this foundation, like these foundations held by all these big capitalist figures that we have now, they do important work. And let me tell you, if you want to get some ugly internet comments, write an article criticizing these foundations. I'm sure that Tim has found this to be the case too, because people enjoy just reading titles of articles they see on Facebook. People don't like to read all the words or whatever. And so people will say things like, well, if this author's saying that Bill Gates shouldn't spend money to fight malaria, he's just showing his privilege. But no one, I don't make that argument, and nor has any living human, right? The point is, these decisions and programs and battles like fighting the pandemic, these are way too important to be in the hands of some jacked up billionaire. Maybe tomorrow they wake up and they're in a pissed off mood, or they're getting divorced, or they have a stroke, and they don't feel like funding that anymore. It can go away overnight, So it's a not reliable thing. If you look at like Mike Bloomberg's history with philanthropy, it's a great example of this because he gets into diseases and makes a lot of social media noise about and goes on TV and talks about how he's fighting them with his foundation money. And then he gets bored with them. And like those programs go away and he stops putting that money into it. So the fact that it's monopoly money in the first place and then mostly used to cover up his image back when he really needed it in the 90s. That to me is kind of the ugly backstory of the foundation before we get into its self-dealing and charter school buffoonery and all that junk.
Okay, we'll get back to that. I also want to talk about that rocking in the chair thing and how all his employees emulated that. I thought that was kind of interesting. I've always wondered myself if he's maybe a little bit on the spectrum, Bill Gates. It's like Zuckerberg and some of these other people. I think he's also on the spectrum. But getting back to this catalytic philanthropy and creative capitalism. So basically, you're saying that he's using this foundation to fund other businesses and other foundations or nonprofits by his other wealthy friends. Can you give some examples of that?
Yeah, so my my investigation found $2 billion, and this is tax deductible charity going to companies, to private companies. And I think all of what Rob said kind of gives a lot of great context and sort of sets the table for understanding who Bill Gates is. And I'm sure your listeners are savvier than this, Lauren, but some of us, I think, have been lulled into this idea of Bill Gates as sort of an indiscriminate sort of charity worker who's just giving money to save the children, the Boys and Girls Club, which he is. But he's also giving money to, MasterCard, IBM, Unilever, NBC, name the multinational company, and there very well could be a multi-million-dollar donation there. But not only that, as you know, he's given $80 million to the private school where his children attended. This private school in Seattle that charges $35,000 a year in tuition. I mean, to me, I just can't see how that is not, how somehow that falls within any definition that we have of charity. But there it is.
And you talk about his donation to MasterCard, which is a private company, and some other private companies. And I don't understand how this is legal. You talk about the IRS and their inability to investigate it or regulate it. Talk about how this is even legal to give charitable money to a profit-making company. I don't understand that.
Yeah, I didn't really understand it either. And I'm not sure that it makes sense that we're going to arrive at some understanding of it. But the IRS says if you can give money to a private company, the only check and balance here is you have to keep a little bit of extra paperwork so that if we want to look, we can see that the money going to the private company was used for a charitable purpose and only for a charitable purpose. So, the result of this model of charity, though, is that we're ending up, the Gates Foundation is the most direct beneficiaries. Who's getting the money from the Gates Foundation, in some cases, are these, the wealthiest companies in the world. I mean, we all think of the Gates Foundation as helping the poorest, but maybe the model is actually helping the wealthy purportedly help the poor.
And what about his own personal interests? Now, you said you weren't able to prove self-dealing, but you did show that $250 million went to corporations in which the foundation holds stock. Because obviously foundations have endowments, they invest their endowments. And so that's kind of a conflict of interest, one would think.
Yeah, certainly. I think it would meet the common definition of a financial conflict of interest to have a private foundation with your name on it and to give money to companies in which your foundation is invested. So my investigation found, so again, there's $2 billion going to private companies and charitable donations, and $250 million is going to companies in which the Gates Foundation holds stocks or bonds. So the IRS rules for what is called self-dealing, which is kind of like what I think we would call conflict of interest. They're very narrowly defined. So it only really triggers when it's a really egregious conflict of interest. So instead of the Gates Foundation having a $3 million equity stake in a company, they would have to be like a 90% owner of the company for that to seem like a financial conflict of interest to the IRS.
And can you also talk about his investments in these industries that are kind of in conflict with his mission, such as prisons, fast food, the arms industry, pharmaceutical companies, fossil fuels, conflicting with its charitable mission to improve health and well-being? What did you find out about that?
I mean, if you look at where the Gates Foundation is invested, so, again, they sit on $50 billion. This is their endowment. That's money that comes from Bill and Melinda Gates, from Warren Buffett, and then also from investment income. So they're invested into anything and everything. They have this very diversified portfolio. According to its most recent tax filings in 2018, it generated more than $8 billion in investment income. And that's, a far greater sum of money than the Gates Foundation gave away in charitable grants. So this is kind of the one issue that I feel like journalists have. I mean, it's been sporadic, but the most consistent, I think, critical lens that I've seen on the Gates Foundation over the years is this kind of moral conflict of interest issue, where they're investing in fossil fuels or chocolate companies tied to child labor, or private prisons or arms manufacturers, in the way that would seem to conflict with the social mission and the public goods mission of the Gates Foundation. So I feel like, you could do a Google search and find a number of those kind of stories over the years.
Now, can you talk about his investment or his donations giving? I don't know whether investment donations, if there's even a line between them, in what I call education privatization, charter schools. Everybody who fights education privatization knows that Bill Gates puts a lot of money into this. And he's considered one of the liberal billionaires, along with Eli Broad and some other people here in the state of California that contribute to this. And the underlying worry is that what his goal is to replace certified teachers, trained teachers, with minimum wage classroom managers that sit at the front of the room keeping order while children are learning on tablets. Either of you can talk about that if you've looked into it.
Rob, you want to take this?
Yeah, well, this isn't my specialty, but just as an educator, I can tell you that there's a lot of alarm in education about noises that we're hearing lately, including from figures like Governor Cuomo in New York, who everyone's turning to just as a moderately sane voice during this crisis. They don't have to listen to Emperor Nero when they need reassurance. But Cuomo, I mean, is a typical conservative Democrat, and he's wanting to cut Medicaid during this crisis, closing down hospitals in the state's pretty ugly. One thing he's proposing just lately is saying, this is from memory, but he said just this week, we're looking at how all these kids can't go to school because schools are closed during the coronavirus. And do we really need this model where someone is teaching in the front of the room and the kids are listening? With this technology we have, maybe we don't need that kind of model at all. Now, notice that's for like the public school system. That's not what will happen for the kids who come from wealthy families. They're going to, if you come from a family like the Gates, Bill Gates grew up knowing the governor of the state of Washington, here where I live. He comes from a wealthy family. He went to a private schools. His children continue to go to private academies. This is kind of common in Silicon Valley. Zuckerberg and several of the other wonderkin kids all went to these private schools. They will continue to have actual inhuman education. And they're going to have small class sizes with a lot of support staff and a lot of enrichment in the workplace. All these liberal, namby-pamby, pro-education ideas, that's what happens in wealthy kids' schools. For the majority, we're going to be getting, yes, this new charter school method, which Gates is one of the great national leaders of, where the public, we're still paying taxes to fund these schools. But we no longer have any public control over the curriculum. That's written by a panel of people appointed by the investors in the school. And they're not going to be promoting big curricula about how we should bring back progressive taxes to take away some of this money that these guys got from their monopoly software empires, So it definitely does fit into Gates' model of education. But right now, I mean, like you guys were kind of saying, our media environment is so debased. Everyone sees this. He's one of the nice liberal billionaires like Warren Buffett, not like those bad billionaires like Koch brothers and Donald Trump. Like that really is the only line. If you're better than Donald Trump now, whatever horrible ideas you have about education or charity or whatever it is, we will take you completely seriously in the commercial media. So definitely, you know, you could see how this easily fits into their idea of what charity and the economy should be.
Yeah, and what's interesting about the Cuomo announcement, so he's engaged Gates, I guess, as a kind of informal advisor to help him reimagine educational policy in New York, and with a real focus on educational technologies. And if you go to Microsoft's webpage, you'll see that they're very much involved in educational technologies, including, I think, some of the specific ones that Cuomo mentions, like these kind of remote learning devices, so on and so forth. And, you know, Bill Gates has stepped down from the board of Microsoft, but he still remains very active in the company as a technology advisor. So, you know, I don't see how there's not, you know, a specter of a financial conflict of interest for Bill Gates to be advising Cuomo on this. But
yeah. Cuomo's got a lot of people who have conflict of interest. He's put the head of BlackRock in to be like the czar of the coronavirus recovery in New York. And these are people who he has big donors to his campaign are all being put in charge of these things. Cuomo is so corrupt. And it's one of the things I did a deep dive into him with Rob Galbraith from Buffalo, New York, who has been following him for a little think tank called Lil Sis. It's supposed to be the opposite of Big Brother. And he's been reporting on Cuomo for 8 years. And we talked about all his web of corruption. So it's, you know, Naomi Klein wrote about that dystopian future. And I posted on Facebook, I said, this is one of the most frightening things I've ever read about what they're talking about in New York. And it's shock doctrine. You know, she's always writing about shock doctrine. And progressives are trying to see how can we have a positive shock doctrine from this coronavirus. You know, you look at the picture behind me, and it's Los Angeles with no traffic and no smog. You know, and so people are talking about we're opening up some streets. You know, we're closing it off to cars so that pedestrians can have more space and social distance, as so many people are taking walks now. And in Berkeley, they're actually closing off streets so their restaurants can have outdoor dining. I mean, there's two ways we can go with this thing. We can either go with the positive shock doctrine where we, you know, we absolve student debt and we stimulate the economy and we bring in Medicare for all, you know, but this is what Pelosi doesn't want to do. You know, she didn't want to have COVID coverage through Medicare because God forbid, or $2,000 a month. This was in the HEROES Act. Pramila Jayapal was fighting for these things, or $2,000 a month, because that might lead to universal basic income or Medicare for all, or any of these things that Pelosi's corporate donors don't want to see. But getting back to Bill Gates, let's talk about the thing with you. You talk about how he has interest in patent protection on drugs. And I'm concerned about this because, you know, Gilead Sciences has this treatment called remdesivir, which I was asking you to find out if Bill Gates had investments in, because this is a treatment that he's pushing. And he also was pushing home swab tests. And just the other day, I noticed that the FDA declined. He introduced it on the 13th, and on the 15th, the FDA pulled it off the market. They said they weren't saying there was anything wrong with it, but they just weren't ready for it yet. So I was kind of wondering, you know, was there really something wrong with it? Or is, you know, because the FDA is run by Trump, is Trump on, you know, against Bill Gates? I was just like, I'm always thinking of ulterior motives for everything that I read. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on either of those things.
I mean, the self-swab, you know, I'm not a medical expert, but it sounds like a good idea. And I know a number of different groups and organizations and companies are involved in that. I don't know that there's any political intrigue behind the FDA's rejection or suspension or whatever it was, denial of Gates' approach to that. I will say on, how is it called?
Remdesivir.
Remdesivir. I only know it in print. I have never actually said those words before. So the USAID today, I just saw this before the interview started, they did a big fact check. It said apparently there's a rumor going around that Dr. Fauci and Bill Gates have investments, or they stand to gain from the use of this drug, which is a therapy for COVID, right? And the USA Today, there's all of this fact checking happening right now around the Gates Foundation, but it always goes in one direction, which is to defend the Gates Foundation from rumors and allegations. I've never seen a fact checking site actually look at the Gates Foundation in a way that challenges the factual basis or the factual assertions of anything the Gates Foundation does. And it's really kind of reached a new peak right now in the COVID area. I mean, there are a lot of conspiracy theories going around the Gates Foundation, but there's also lots of things that the Gates Foundation is doing and saying that we could be fact checking that aren't happening. So this USA Today article, it kind of just flats out says it's a complete falsehood that Bill Gates or the Gates Foundation could benefit in any way from remdesivir. But if you look at the Gates Foundation, the journalist could have done this, who wrote this at USA Today. If you look at the Gates Foundation's endowment, their most recent IRS filings, it shows like $1.5 million invested in Gilead, which is the owner of this drug, right? The patent holder. And this drug, I mean, the company has, gone up like a lot of healthcare and pharmaceutical companies this year. It's gone up like 15, 20%. So, supposing that the Gates Foundation still has this company in their portfolio, then he does stand to gain or to benefit. Now, it's a small holding that they have. I don't think that Gates' primary interest in COVID, in any part of COVID, is to make money. But, if and when that's happening, we have to take note of it. And when it's happening, like I found in the Nation article, that $250 million are given to private companies in which the foundation has investments, then you're starting to look at a bigger number. And I think you really have to take note.
Yeah, you also say that $250 million was given to media companies, and many of them are giving him favorable coverage. And you talk about the next Netflix documentary, which I didn't even watch because it was directed by Davis Guggenheim, who I actually met. He did Waiting for Superman, which we know was funded by Philip Anschutz from AEG. And he's one of those Christian dominionists in the mold of Betsy DeVos. And this Waiting for Superman lauded charter schools. It praised Michelle Rhee, who was the chancellor of the DC school system, who was later found to be cheating so her students could get better test scores. And so he, and nobody knew who had funded this documentary. So everybody was walking around. This was in the days when they were villainizing teachers and teachers' unions. Now, fortunately, teachers' unions fought back. And as we know, last year there were a lot of strikes, and teachers, are now held in higher esteem. But this movie and a feature film that was very similar to it, also funded by these interests, really portrayed them in a pejorative way. Davis Guggenheim and I tangled because I tried to ask him a question about this when I saw him at an event. And all I had to do was mention the name Diane Ravitch, who is the guru for our anti-privatization movement. And he just lashed out at me. I couldn't believe it because I was just trying to ask a question. He didn't even let me finish his question. So what do you want to say about him and the media companies that he funds and his image?
Yeah, so I have a piece coming out in Columbia Journalism Review, hopefully very, very soon, that looks at that number, that $250 million that the Gates Foundation is given to media companies and journalism outlets. So you might even be surprised to learn that, some of the journalism outlets that you probably look to for news, ProPublica, Al Jazeera, BBC, the list goes on and on and on. Those media outlets are getting money from the Gates Foundation. There, I think, are probably a lot of reasons why there isn't more critical reporting on the Gates Foundation, and certainly more investigative reporting. But I think you have to look at the financial ties of the Gates Foundation as one reason for that. With Davis Guggenheim, it's this incredible, Netflix has become known for its documentaries. And last fall, or was it this year? No, it was last fall. They issued a 3-part docuseries on Bill Gates. It was like 3 hours long. I think it really stretches the definition of documentary. It's more of a hagiography. But as you know, it's directed by Davis Guggenheim, whose last film received $2 million from the Gates Foundation, which he put to the media company Participant Media to promote the film. So, you know, it's not like Davis Guggenheim. I don't think we could say that Davis Guggenheim approached this as somebody without an opinion about Bill Gates.
Yeah, I would say the one investigative journalism piece that I wrote was an investigation into the Tickells, Oliver and Rebecca Tickells movie called Pump. And it was supposed to be about choice. And you know, whenever you hear that word choice, you start thinking neoliberalism. And it turns out it was funded, you know, it basically talked about getting off of fossil fuels, but going on to CNG, natural gas from fracking. And they're supposed to be big environmentalists. So I wrote this big piece that was in Truth Out or Alternate. Well, whatever it is, I'll send it to you guys because I'm really proud of it. I'll also post it in the comments, folks. But, you know, so you think that somebody based, and he had also done did he do an Inconvenient Truth? Yeah, so he does an Inconvenient Truth. And now, of course, we have all sorts of doubts about Al Gore, you know, and he was talked about in Planet of the Humans, which unfortunately, because it had such bad information on renewables, it is being totally discounted. But it had some great information on bought off big green groups and also green capitalism, which Al Gore is a major beneficiary of. So now I've got to relook at an Inconvenient Truth with a more critical eye. But getting back to Bill Gates in his Microsoft days, talk about how he would, you know, it's so contrast to his benign, friendly, professorial, kindly image that he used to rant at employees and rock in his chair.
Yes, of course. So by now, you know, Gates is getting up in years and he has this grandfatherly look to him. And so it's kind of like George W. Bush, like he's old. It's been several years since his horrible wrongdoings and crimes. And so people have a short memory and they're looking at Donald Trump. All this like staring at the sun. You look away and then you can't see anything anymore, I think. So with Gates, it's a similar case. You know, now he has his philanthropy and he's aged. People forget. But the realities are pretty ugly. And again, you know, any corporate environment has fairly strict hierarchies. Your viewers may have jobs and they may be aware that there's limits to what you can get away with saying to your boss and your managers and so on. And some of those are legit and some of them are just kind of the authoritarian hierarchical organization of the modern business firm. Now, that's something that's just a basic part of our economic institutions. But then, of course, you do learn a lot about people based on how they act when they gain some power over people. Maybe a little bit of power, maybe a lot of power. And with a lot of these figures, and actually I didn't expect this until I started doing the research for my own book, I don't know what it is about this industry, but technology really does draw people who are especially prone to being bullying, megalomaniacal tyrants toward their subordinates. And again, we all get in arguments and yell at people sometimes, you know, we lose our temper. It's very different when you're yelling or being abusive towards someone who's below you in an economic hierarchy, like whom you can fire or cut their pay or their benefits or whatever. Like that's a very different deal. What I discovered is looking at these tech figures, I mean, Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos is a very famous case. He has every book, every sympathetic corporate biography you read about Amazon has a different set of stories about how abusive Bezos is to his employees. But Gates really begins the story that Steve Jobs and Bezos then carry on. So, I mean, it's a rich literature, and you can see some of the anecdotes in my book. But there's a lot of cases of yelling at subordinates and just being a very tyrannical, and not even that, just like being incredibly like petty and tantrum prone. Like Bill Gates walked out of a puff piece interview with Connie Chung, who's not exactly Michael Moore when she's, you know, interviewing someone. Like she doesn't really go for your jugular. That's not a reputation she has. But he walked out in that interview because he was impatient. He got bored and he's used to telling people what to do, and he decided the interview is over. So we have a lot of cases of Gates screaming at his subordinates and firing them for displeasing them, sometimes for petty reasons. We have a lot of episodes where that played a role in furthering Microsoft's monopoly. So in some company like Novell or Lotus would have applications or networking software that partially competed with Windows. We have several biographers who describe him at different times as saying, we've got to crush this company. We're going to crush this competitor of mine. And they all refer specifically to him slamming his fist into his open hand. So it's not just bullying your subordinates. It also plays a role in how you seek to reorganize the workplace and concentrate it. And so you see, because these workplaces are, like all of them tend to be, very hierarchical, in every one of these tech firms, very quickly, there's this like gross, twisted cult of personality around the CEOs. And again, like we've already said tonight, like we tend to celebrate these figures and kiss their butts all the time. But within the firm, it's just complete ass kissery. So Apple's famous for having a bunch of Steve Jobs clones around the early 2000s, where everyone's wearing turtlenecks and glasses and stuff on the Apple corporate campus. But the same is true with Microsoft. And we have a couple records where, because Gates is known, especially in his younger days when they were striving and still struggling to build up their network and build up their monopoly. We have records of him during meetings rocking back and forth. And the way I remember one of his corporate biographers, I think this was Erickson, I forget, said this was to contain his intensity. Ooh. Not sure how I don't know about that. But these days, of course, we recognize that kind of behavior as being like stimming and referring to people who may perhaps be on the autism spectrum, as they say. And I will say, after this book came out, I had a number of people write to me and say, you shouldn't pick on people for all rocking back and forth. I'm not picking on people for doing their stimming. Like that's part of what they need to do to get through their social discomfort that we learn about when you hear about this issue. That's fine. The reason that anecdote is striking in the first place, and the only reason I want to include it and why we should be aware of it, is we have records where people go into meetings with Gates, corporate meetings where Gates is running the meeting, and all of the executives are all rocking back and forth. They aren't all autistic. Come on. Like some of these people are just doing what Steve Jobs lackeys did with the turtleneck, but they're doing it with his behavioral cues instead. To me, that just speaks to like the gross cultish aspects that you get within a corporate hierarchical setting, I guess.
You have another quote in here where you say, in public, he said, who decides what's in Windows? The customers who buy it. But at a dinner party, the talk turned to politics and he bragged, of course I have as much power as the president has.
Indeed. And he had a legitimate case. I mean, this is the, guys, relax. It's the 90s in this story. And back then, that's how computers ran. I mean, a small portion of the market runs Apple and has Mac computers, mostly in things like art and graphic design and so on. This is before the mobile era changed everything, obviously. But back at that time, all the time, when he would speak publicly, when he got dragged in front of Congress, when he gave his deposition for the antitrust case, and this actually came back to bite them in the ass once their actual emails were entered into the record, which contradicted almost everything that he said. But publicly, he would always say, well, as the public decides, if public doesn't like something I'm doing with Windows, they can stop it. But it's such a sham, because after all, this was a monopolized industry. Microsoft, all through the 90s, had a market share for computer operating systems north of 90%. You don't have to have literally 100% of sales to be recognized as a monopoly. If you make 9 out of 10 units in a market and your company goes out of existence tomorrow and it destroys the market, that means you have that weight in the marketplace to shape outcomes. And again, if you dig into the details, what you find, especially in the events leading up to the antitrust case, was that all the executives at Microsoft were very attentive and very invested in deciding exactly what would go into Windows and exactly what wouldn't go into Windows, like when they did their updates like Windows 95 and stuff, and all the applications and software that came with it. And they made very strategic decisions about, why are we letting this third-party company make a word processing system and letting it interface with Windows? We should make it harder for them because we have stupid Microsoft Word that no one likes, which we all have to use because of the network effect. So we should make it harder for them. Like they really were strategizing behind the scenes, doing exactly what Gates said publicly again and again that they weren't doing. They were specifically using their power over operating systems to strategically keep other companies out or to gradually push them off the operating system so they could take over that segment of the industry. It's not a very pretty story, and we wouldn't know it, except Microsoft let its antitrust case go to court. Gates was so cocky, he was sure he could win this case. No other company lets their case go to court, because if you do, all of the emails and all these shitty internal communications and stuff that you say about crushing competitors goes into the public record, and jerk economists and journalists were free to look at that stuff then. So I'm always very excited when that happens. Only Gates went to the point of letting it get all the way to a jury trial so we could get our hands on his dirty laundry. But that's how we know the history is the opposite of what he swore up and down in public was the case.
Okay, so we got to wrap up now, and I want to go to what the problem is with these foundations ultimately, because when you're not paying your taxes, when you're sheltering, there was an article in Recode here. Teddy Schleifer, finance and influence editor at technology news website Recode, on Wednesday, tweeted out a link to his story about how Bill Gates is working to convince his fellow billionaires to donate more for the battle against the coronavirus pandemic. Gates is apparently discussing plans to pool donations from more than 200 billionaires. Nothing concrete has been established to this point, however. The idea may fly in the face of the Giving Pledge's website's message, which says, quote, it does not solicit support for any specific philanthropic foundation, cause, or organization. So I don't know if any of you were paying attention to that, but even Milton Friedman said, and this was in your article, Rob, it would be nice if we could rely on the voluntary activities of individuals to house and care for the madmen, but I think we cannot rule out the possibility that such charitable activities will be inadequate. And that's sort of the quote that I used when I started the program, when Gates was talking about there needs to be larger systemic change because if you do it as in private investment, there's going to be insufficient return. So I want to close getting your reaction to this tweet that AOC made the other day. She writes, if only there was some public fund billionaires could pay into, along with everyone else, that helps fund our infrastructure, hospitals, and public systems all at once. It could even be a modest percentage of what they earn every year. We could have an agency collected and everything. And somebody who didn't catch the joke wrote, it's called the income tax. So your guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's very thoughtful. And that's very typical of AOC, having someone then say, you're making what sounds like a joke here. And we should say the guy who made that hopeless post is the head of the Congressional Budget Hawks. The guy saying we don't need a UBI to keep people alive during COVID-19. We should just give money to the defense industry and it'll be fine. But it's a pretty goofy situation, yeah. But what you started with is exactly right. Like even high-ranking people at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have said, our responsibility is a drop in the bucket compared to the government's responsibility. Fighting even something much smaller than COVID-19, like say the Ebola outbreak through last year, cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a very expensive program. And the Gates and the other foundations were happy to put a little bit of money into it and make sure that that went out on TV and got them some attention. But it's a tiny little piece of it. And Friedman, of course, recognized that in that exact quote there. And that's one reason why Milton Friedman isn't libertarian enough for a lot of libertarians. I've debated a few of them, and they consider him kind of a smushy sellout because he's willing to consider maybe Social Security could be kept in some form, or maybe, yes, churches can't handle caring for people with schizophrenia, which is the most ridiculous idea. So there's also more aggressive versions of that. I wrote a whole book about Friedman, and people can follow up on that if they want to. It's a separate project there. But it is amazing. It's nice to see these guys occasionally concede it. I hope that AOC gets some traction with this taxing wealthy people, this new idea. We should try that someday.
Your thoughts, Tim?
Yeah, so I mean, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have organized this thing called the Giving Pledge, where they're trying to get the richest Americans and the richest global citizens to donate their money to charities, to donate most of their money during their lifetime to charity. And some of the billionaires who have signed on to this pledge are very explicit that it's a way around paying taxes, that if they don't give their money away, they're going to have to pay an enormous sum of taxes on it. And they feel like they are better, more efficient, more meritorious stewards of their money. So instead, they can donate it as philanthropists in a way that influences public policy, that reshapes society to their own ideologies and ambitions, and instead of giving it to the government. But it really is all about this kind of unaccountable exercise of power, because when a billionaire uses philanthropy to shape public policy, there's very little transparency, and there's no mechanism for any of us to really, provide checks and balance over the work it does.
I want to just close with the quote that you used to end your article. 100 years ago, when oil baron John D. Rockefeller asked Congress to provide him with a charter to start a private foundation, his ambitions were soundly rejected as an anti-democratic power grab. As Theodore Roosevelt said at the time, no amount of charities in spending such fortunes can compensate in any way for the misconduct in acquiring them. So I think that really does apply to Bill Gates. I want to thank you both for being on the show and talking about this. And I hope that if I want to have you on to discuss either of your two books, the one you held up and the one that's the one that I had asked be sent to me, and your new article that you're working on, that you'll consider coming back on. In the meantime, I want to tell the viewers that I'm looking to try to get Pramila Jayapal for my show on Wednesday. I've been supporting her effort to fight back against Nancy Pelosi with this performative bill, the HEROES Act, that she knew would not get passed, but still was not progressive enough. And poor Pramila Jayapal and Mark Pocan, they could only get 9 people from their progressive caucus of 95 members to vote against the rule. Nancy Pelosi wanted to pass it, and she did pass it on Wednesday with no discussion, no amendments, except for things that she was privately negotiating on beforehand. And 9 people in the squad, and Ro Khanna, Chuy Garcia, and Katie Porter voted against that rule. But then when it failed and they had the vote, every single person voted for it except for Pramila Jayapal. So it's very hard for progressives right now to get anything done in Congress, which is why I am an activist on the outside. And we actually had an action at Jimmy Gomez's office, which people can see on my YouTube channel, in which we asked him to show that he was a progressive and stand with Pramila Jayapal. And he didn't. He didn't vote against the rule. He voted for the bill. And everybody's now getting to say, oh, look, it's those big bad Republicans that are stopping us, when meanwhile, they put in their provisions to bail out lobbyists and chambers of commerce who get plenty of money from the businesses that we already bailed out. So again, thank you very much for being on the show, guys. And I want to thank everybody at home and say, stay home, stay safe, and keep fighting.